Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, Ireland. As winter sets in, so too does austerity. But as the calls grow louder for a collective response to Europe's woes, what more can Ireland do? Also, North and South. Southern Sudan's on the road to independence, but what will happen to the oil and the money if that happens? And progress versus protection as the latest UN climate change conference wraps up. We head to the Amazon to see the real effects. Speaking of climate, if you are sitting in Europe right now watching this broadcast, there's a good chance it's snowing outside. Dare I say, it is Europe's winter of discontent, an economic malaise that's settled over the continent and isn't going anywhere, particularly, it seems, if Europe doesn't work together. At least that is what some big economic minds are saying right now. People like Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the head of the International Monetary Fund, who said, "My view is simple. The Eurozone must find a comprehensive solution to this problem. It is not a good approach that for every country we find a separate solution." But clearly there is still a split. Ideas like a common Eurozone bond or an enlarged crisis fund have been rejected by the likes of Germany. But if they're being ruled out and an individual approach is being discouraged too, then where's the answer? Coming up this week, discussions with Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister, but crucially for us, the Finance Minister for 10 years before that. Also, John Bruton, the former Irish Prime Minister, who's now trying to promote Ireland as a financial services destination. And that is where we will start this week. Ireland. Austerity is in place and there is a tough road ahead. Here's Jonah Hull in Dublin.
Well, outside the Parliament building, the Dáil here in Dublin, protests greeted the budget as it was read out by Finance Minister Brian Lenihan inside. There is a lot of anger in Ireland, anger at the banks, anger at the government for its mismanagement of the economy and the crash that followed. But more widely than all of this, there is a broader acceptance that Ireland really doesn't have much of a choice, that it must accept these austerity measures, that it must take the bailout money on offer. The broader sense seems to be the sooner the pain gets underway, the sooner it'll be over.
On a crucial day for Ireland, no one is happy about the harshest budget in the country's history. Most anger is aimed at the banks and the politicians, whose failure many feel has led to a humiliating bailout. Beyond that, though, sentiment now seems to be, let's get on with it.
Doesn't look like we've got much of a choice, really, unless we follow the French idea and just have a revolution or something out there.
I'm very worried, really worried about how I'm going to survive, go to work, pay childminders. You know, I am worried, but I don't know what's going to happen. It's only going to get worse, I think.
The government is teetering close to collapse, but its minute majority should see the budget pass, enabling the release of much-needed EU and IMF bailout funds.
With public anger so high, a general election is all but inevitable. And with government popularity so low, a new government is likely sometime in the new year, taking the helm through years of tough austerity to come. It'll be a long, hard road for Ireland towards eventual economic recovery.
And there are no guarantees.
The bailout in a simple sum was 85 billion, of which 17.5 billion is our own money. Like getting a mortgage, where the bank says, we'll give you 80% if you put up 20. That's what we've done. Is it big enough, number one? The answer is no to that. And number two, is it the right sort of restructuring? And the answer to that, again, is no, it's not. There should have been an element of resolution or debt forgiveness.
Watching closely from outside, the IMF and EU, whose finance ministers met in Brussels on Tuesday to finalise the terms of Ireland's bailout. They're anxious to see the bailout go ahead, hoping to send a positive signal to the markets and buy a reprieve, however brief, for Portugal and much larger Spain. As Ireland suffers the pain, the wider debt crisis goes on. The Eurozone must somehow convince the markets that the euro itself is not in fact in jeopardy. It hasn't done enough yet.
For the Eurozone, of course, the crisis doesn't begin and end in Ireland. Eurozone ministers and governments well aware that the markets will continue to circle above the debt-ridden economies of Europe. It is now imperative that Europe come together and convince the markets that it is strong enough to withstand anything, that it will stand by its members, that the euro, the stability of the euro itself is not in fact in jeopardy. That will require some tough political measures to be put in place, perhaps strengthening the bailout fund, looking towards a more permanent mechanism after 2013. There's plenty of work still to be done. Even if Ireland gets out of the starting blocks, the crisis isn't over.
No, certainly isn't. Let's hear from some of those economic minds, though, that we talked about earlier. We start with Gordon Brown, the UK's finance minister from 1997 to 2007, during which time he blocked any moves to join the Eurozone and might have just saved his country a whole lot of bother in doing so. He spoke to Al Jazeera's Barbara Serra.
It was a political decision that was made to have the euro, and I think people recognised that this was a testimony to Europe's willingness to unify and to work together. And in principle, the euro is a great idea because it removes currency speculation within the area of the euro. It means that you've got less barriers to investment.
But an idea that doesn't work?
But in practice, it's got to be made to work by there being greater flexibility. The problem at the moment is that markets are leading the euro area, and the euro area has got to start to lead the markets.
What advice would you give countries like Ireland and Portugal then?
I think my advice is it's got to be part of a European-wide solution, and I think if people think that the problem is just one of the periphery and not a problem for the whole of the euro area, and indeed the whole of Europe, even members of the European Union who are outside the euro area like us, they're wrong. This is a problem that could affect trade between Europe and many, many countries in the world, and therefore diminish the chances of growth and employment if it's not dealt with.
Can you ever see a time when it's in the UK's best interest to join the euro?
This is not the time to discuss this. And I always said it was wrong for Britain in 2005 when we made the decision not to join. It's wrong in 2010, and I think it's wrong for the foreseeable future. It is not in the best interest of Britain not to have the flexibility that is needed to create the growth that we need over the next few years if we're going to keep unemployment down.
And Gordon Brown also had some advice for the likes of Ireland. He said, be part of a European-wide solution if you want to get out of this. Now, it's an idea I put to John Bruton in the years between 1994 and 1997. He was Ireland's Prime Minister. He reckons Ireland's export economy will hold it in good stead with Europe.
Well, exports represent about 90% of Ireland's GDP, as against, say, 25% of Britain's GDP. And a lot of those exports go to the rest of Europe. So by being in the European Union, we have better control over our own destiny because we're part of the European decision-making structure than we would be if we were going it alone. I think also the recently agreed programme between the European Union, the IMF and the Irish authorities sets out a fairly rigid 4-year parameter for our public finances, which gives stability and predictability as far as that can be done, as to how we're going to deal with the banking crisis and with the difficulties in government finances. And that's good for business.
And yet there was so much resistance to it, the bailout. If we're talking IMF and EU, there was so much resistance to the idea of going, as people like to say, cap in hand. In the end, though, was it really the only logical choice?
I think it probably was, because we allowed ourselves to get into the difficulty we were in. I mean, there's no doubt that serious mistakes were made in allowing borrowing to invest in one sector, construction, to rise so quickly as it did between 2003 and 2007. Serious mistakes were made there, and we're now having to pay for those mistakes, and that spilled over as well into government finances, where expenditure by the government increased faster than was sustainable, and that also is being rectified. But I think the important thing to say is that as far as the economic crisis in all of the West is concerned, all that it has done is reveal certain underlying unsustainabilities in our welfare state system, in our systems of public expenditure, and in our coping with the problem of the ageing of our societies. And we're being forced, as a result of the crisis, to deal with things we were going to have to deal with anyway, but deal with them rather sooner and hopefully rather less expensively than we would have had to do if the problem was brought to light later.
Okay, so it's been exposed, it's exposed things which we perhaps wouldn't have seen in the first place. You were Prime Minister at the start of the boom, which was more the, as we've talked about earlier, the export-driven side of the boom before the property came in. Did you ever at that point, or in the years afterwards, look at Ireland's economy and think, maybe this is all going too well? Working on the theory of the bigger the up, the steeper the down.
Well, from about 1993 forward to about 2001, 2002, it was obvious that Ireland's economy was becoming increasingly more competitive, and that therefore the growth in economic activity was based on an absolutely solid foundation. But after that, Ireland's economy became remarkably less competitive. But we continued to grow at the same pace, this time not on the basis of production, but on the basis of credit.
So overheating, essentially.
Overheating, a property bubble.
There was a headline I've read, just to get back sort of more down to ground level, I guess, a headline which I've read here which says that Ireland's financial crisis has wounded the country's psyche. Now, it's tough, definitely. Austerity measures are in place, and it's going to be tough for a good many years, and there's a shock factor now as well. Is it that bad on the ground, do you think?
I think the rapidity of the change of fortune, or apparent change of fortune, has certainly shocked people. Remember, we've had experience now from the early mid-90s of rates of growth of 10, 11, 12% in some years. And now, for the first time in a long time, we're seeing our economy actually contract. And that's something that many Irish people have never seen in their lifetimes. And of course that has a disruptive effect. But we're coming down from a very high platform. We were in a situation where, for example, in 1990 there were only 1 million people working in Ireland. There are now 1.9 million people working in Ireland. It also means, however, that we have room to make economies without imposing really severe hardship on people, because there is comparatively a well-off population there. We have a relatively low tax burden. Almost half the current population don't pay income tax even though they're working. The threshold at which you enter the tax net is much higher in Ireland than it is, say, in the United Kingdom. Our expenditure levels have increased very fast in a very short period in the last 4 to 4 years. We're now in a position where we can adjust that downwards, the expenditure, and adjust the tax upwards, without necessarily imposing severe hardship. It's something we can do. It's something I think Irish people are determined that they will do, so that we can get back on the right path.
When counting the cost returns more business news from the rest of the world, including Sudan, with the potential creation of a new country has people wondering what happens to the oil wealth. That and more just ahead. Welcome back to Counting the Cost, your weekly business stop, right here on Al Jazeera. Last week we told you about Cancun, the big UN climate change conference that's been going on there. Of course, one of the big issues to do with climate change is deforestation, where you cut down the trees, but effectively you remove part of the Earth's lungs in the process. And what for? Well, have a look at Manaus, one of Brazil's fastest growing cities, but caught between preservation and progress. Gabriel Elizondo has more.
Manaus, a place famous for its unique location right in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon, the world's most diverse and valued natural ecosystem. Manaus thus is often referred to as the heart of the Amazon. But if that's true, it's a heart now beating very fast after being overworked. According to new census data, the city's population grew to 1.7 million people, a 22% rise in the last decade. It's one of the fastest growing cities in all of Brazil. This is troubling to environmentalists, who say the city's growth in population means a larger human footprint in the Amazon.
What is worrying for Manaus, being the heart of the Amazon, is the effect that growth is having on the environment. The accumulation of people in an unplanned manner is done in a way where there is no environmental concern. Today, for example, all the freshwater tributaries from the Amazon River are polluted because of the population increase in Manaus.
The perimeters of the city, once occupied by forest, are being cut down to make way for fancy new high-rise apartments. New buildings are going up everywhere, all over the city. A new bridge is being built over the Rio Negro, one of the main rivers of the Amazon basin. The bridge will for the first time link Manaus and more rural communities on the other side of the river, potentially allowing for more development into the forest. Those unable to afford new housing are pushed further into the boundaries of the city, infringing into the ecosystem. Manaus is already home to Brazil's largest free trade zone, where some of the biggest names in the world have assembly plants. As more people come to Manaus, so too is the traffic. Rush hour is a snarled mess of gridlock almost every day.
Everything about the Amazon is deeply ingrained in the culture of the people that live here in Manaus. They'll tell you that they know better than anybody the unique responsibility they have living in a city surrounded by one of the world's great ecosystems. But many people here are also conflicted because development has meant progress, and progress has meant job opportunities.
Development in Manaus means more work. We have opportunities, a lot of work, it's progress. It's good for progress, but for the environment, it's something that's negative. More progress means less forest.
The growth of Manaus doesn't appear to be stopping anytime soon. Here, construction crews at work building what will become this, the new football stadium. Manaus will be one of the host cities for the 2014 World Cup. Those who defend the development in Manaus rightly point to Amazonas state, of which Manaus is the capital, as being the least deforested of all of Brazil's Amazon states. The state, they argue, as a whole has progressive environmental programs that balance growth. The largest city in the Brazilian Amazon is facing a collision course between the realities of progress and economic growth versus environmental protection, as the human footprint of Manaus is undeniably getting larger by the day.
And from one climate change issue to another, this time renewable energy. Bottom line is, it's cleaner, it's better for the environment, and we should probably move away from burning coal, oil and gas and harness things like the sun instead. No problem here in a place like Doha, but what about sunny southern England? Tim Friend went to find out if the same could possibly apply.
A break in the clouds and weak winter sunlight briefly shines on Marlow in southern England. It's enough to sustain a quiet revolution here. This town could soon have more solar panels powering homes than anywhere else of a similar size in Britain. And all because of the frustration turned to evangelism of one man.
I mean, obviously ours goes back 30 days, isn't it? I think his goes
Philip Ditchfield became fed up with excuses for inaction over climate change and set out to convince 100 neighbours to go green.
Get 100 houses, we're going to save about 80 metric tonnes of CO2. And the idea is that we want to have like a disproportionate amount of solar in Marlow, so that people walk down the street, they see the panels on our roof, they see them on other roofs, and they say, hang about, something's going on in this town of ours. You know, I didn't think solar power was possible. Well, it clearly is.
Well, it's one of the coldest days of the year so far, and not much sunshine around either. So you might think plans to build more solar panels in a climate like Britain's would be doomed to failure. But the people behind the project here think they can make a real difference and send a message to the rest of the country. Because of financial rebates for solar converts, householders reckon they can recoup their outlay after 10 years. And the more people who join the scheme, the more economically sound it becomes. When the sun really shines, the homes put power back into the national grid for everything from central heating to hot water.
I think it's time that we took responsibility for climate change, and that was my way of one of my ways of taking responsibility.
There's a long way to go, but we're doing our best, and we hope for a lot more installations still to come.
As leaders argue in Mexico over tackling climate change, the people of Marlow believe they're shining a solar beacon for a greener future.
Let's look at Sudan now, a nation which this time next month may be two nations, but will still be sub-Saharan Africa's third biggest producer of crude oil. So not surprisingly, that's a big issue in the coming referendum, which could lead to the official creation of southern Sudan. Take a look at this map. You're going to notice how much of the oil fields are in the south of the country and come under the control of the fast-growing southern capital of Juba. You see it there, 80% of the country's oil production is from the south. In total, the country produces 450,000 barrels a day. That's expected to rise to 600,000 by next December as Sudan exploits its proven reserves of 6.7 billion barrels. Now, up until now, it's worked like this. Southern Sudan is landlocked, of course, so it has to export the oil through a pipeline to Port Sudan on the Red Sea, and so the north and south split the revenue 50-50. By the way, they also split Khartoum's debts of $30 billion right down the middle as well. And despite fears of conflict, there's a big list of foreign oil companies with a stake too. No surprise, China National Petroleum Corporation is at the top of the list. China's the largest foreign player with a roughly 40% stake in Sudan's oil industry. That doesn't mean the people of the south, though, rake in the big bucks. Of the more than $2 billion a year the South receives, the bulk goes to civil servants and the government. And there's a knock-on effect too. This is for neighbouring Uganda and Kenya. Uganda says informal trade with southern Sudan amounts to $170 million a month. But what does all that mean for the prospect of secession? Anita McNaught has been finding out in Juba.
Beyond the stalls of market town Juba, change is everywhere. Concrete encroaching on the traditional mud and straw tukus. The Chinese have moved in. Juba is about to become a boom town, a capital city.
A new independent state of southern Sudan has daunting challenges ahead of it. This is a country that would have to be built from the ground up.
Beyond Juba's handful of new roads, a country larger than France has mostly dirt tracks, impassable in the rainy months. Half the population lives on less than $1 a day. Medical care is sparse and basic. Illiteracy is 85%. Sanitation is almost non-existent. Rubbish, usually uncollected. Piped water, far from widespread. And this is the capital. Far from major centres, there's very little infrastructure at all. Vincent Oywak's a US-Canada educated Sudanese who's returned to help build his new nation.
We have to be careful in our own expectations, and our leaders must also understand that this is a rare moment in history. They must get it right.
Expectations are so high because in theory the country could be rich. Oil has over the past 3 years given the southern government an income of more than $5.1 billion US. But there's little to see from it because much has been spent on the military, keeping the country's fighters happy after 21 years of civil war, not only with the north, but with each other. The country's President Salva Kiir has done much to conciliate, but this year alone, according to the World Food Programme, nearly 250,000 South Sudanese were displaced by inter-ethnic conflict.
How long shall we continue to be fighting ourselves? This is the most effective weapon that has always been used by the authorities in Khartoum to divide the South.
Khartoum is reviled in much of the South, but for years it's also been an excuse for failure. With the South increasingly likely to split away and chart its own destiny, if corruption and poor governance dash the high hopes of people here, South Sudan will have no one but itself to blame.
And just before we go, we had some questions during the week about when you can watch the show online. Basically, it gets uploaded each weekend, but what we do is send out a notification on Twitter. So if you start following us there, you can easily find out when the show is available to view online at AJ Counting Cost, the name to look for. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.